So we're delighted to have with us and extend a very warm welcome to our speakers. So we've got Alistair Blair, Elizabeth Matto, Alison Rios Millett McCartney, Elizabeth Benyon, and Dick Simpson. So in this webinar, colleagues of the editorial team will introduce their book and discuss the core issues that the book seeks to address. The talk is entitled The Challenges and Opportunities of Teaching Civic Engagement. So Alistair, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Martina. So, I mean, I suppose the context, I'll just say a couple of things at the very beginning. Thank you to you and your colleagues, the International Federation of National Teaching Fellows. I am, one of them, so that's great. I'm glad to be part of this community and to be part of your sort of seminar series, which is super. And I believe we can get some colleagues, across the globe in Australia and United States, of course. So I think, for us and for me, I'm probably the late person to this party in many ways, but of the book. But I suppose in the context of the UK, we've had ongoing discussions over the last few years around the nature of civic university and civic university agreement. And some of that is about pulling universities together and responding to our various sort of challenges that we see. Some of that's about education and skills gaps within local communities, how a university can work in that area. And the book, I think, speaks to those challenges, but also provides a context of pedagogy, which is useful and draws obviously ostensibly on work that's been taking place in the United States and is inspired from that. We've got a number of two colleagues who can't be here tonight who are part of the editorial team, Don Whitehead and Ty, and Ty's son, and obviously they played an important part in all of this. And but obviously we've got four other key colleagues here today, and it's really Elizabeth is going to sort of introduce the context of where we're going to go to, but maybe the other colleagues on the editorial team will just say one or two words about themselves and where they're from, just to sort of give a bit of context, if that's okay to begin with. Starting with Elizabeth Matto, Alison, Elizabeth, and Dick, if that's okay.
Sure. So thank you, Alistair. Thank you, Martina. Very much looking forward to the conversation. Wish I could be there in person, to be quite honest. But thank you so much for having us. My name's Elizabeth Matto. I'm an associate research professor at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University in New Jersey. I'll hand off to Alison to introduce herself. Yeah, Alistair, is that what you want us to do?
Yeah, lovely. Yeah, over to Alison and then Elizabeth.
Okay. Hi, folks. My name is Alison Rios Millett McCartney, and I'm professor of political science at Towson University, which is in Baltimore, Maryland. I'm also faculty director of our Honors College. Next.
I'm Elizabeth Benyon. I am Chancellor's Professor of Political Science and Director of the American Democracy Project at Indiana University South Bend in South Bend, Indiana.
And I'm Dick Simpson from the University of Illinois at Chicago.
Super. So I think the next thing is we're just going to maybe just give a bit of a context, or Elizabeth Matto's going to give a bit of a context to the book, and it's a sort of a series of books that have gone before it and where it sits as well.
Okay, yes, thanks. Thank you, Alistair, and really happy to be talking about this book, Teaching Civic Engagement Globally. And as Alistair referenced, it's really our first attempt to think about teaching civic engagement at a global level. As Alistair referenced, we have actually 6 co-editors, a total of 21 chapters, 41 authors. So with our contributors are seeking to really explain, understand, where teacher scholars of democratic education are succeeding, where they're falling short, what the challenges are, but certainly to try to provide a theoretical framework and a set of best practices that can be applied in a variety of democratic contexts. Authors are drawing on a range of global experiences, including case studies from Brazil, China, the Gambia, New Zealand, Russia, South Africa. And we're going to give you a snapshot of these chapters today. As Alistair referenced, though, this is the third publication by the American Political Science Association dedicated to exploring teaching democratic citizenship. Want to say at the outset, and I'll put it in the chat again, all three books are available online for free. Again, I'll put it up on the chat. And on a website housed on the American Political Science Association. And this website is meant to not only house the text, but to also be a supplement to the content in the textbook, all three of the textbooks, whether it's samples of syllabi, rubrics, assessments, and it's also meant to be an ongoing dynamic resource to assist scholars, now scholars globally, who are teaching civic engagement in the classroom. The first book was Teaching Civic Engagement from Student to Active Citizen, and that was published in 2013. And the audience there was really political scientists. It offered a range of models of civic engagement pedagogy from a variety of subdisciplines of political science, and really emphasizing that teaching democratic citizenship is a core mission of the discipline of political science. We built upon that theme and that text with the 2017 publication, Teaching Civic Engagement Across the Disciplines. The theme of that text is really that teaching democratic citizenship is a shared responsibility, that advancing the scholarship, the teaching of democracy requires the support and the encouragement of all disciplines and all subfields of all disciplines. And not only that, but really the campus as a whole, that what's required is a campus culture that's conducive to teaching civic engagement. But in the second book, Teaching Civic Engagement Across the Disciplines, the contributors really broadened our civic learning models, our toolkit, to include not only political science, but English, civil engineering, and even the arts. But certainly, as we all know, and that's probably why we're all here today, that educators around the globe are continuing to face these challenges of teaching civic engagement, with populism on the rise, with authoritarian regimes, habits, leaders being legitimized, and core democratic tenets being undermined. So the work that we're all doing is more important than ever, and really leads us to this next book, Teaching Civic Engagement Globally. So I think at this point, I'm going to hand off to my colleagues, Alistair and Allison, and they'll start to walk you through the 4 different sections of Teaching Civic Engagement Globally, and I'll put the URL in the chat while they're chatting.
Okay, I think, thanks, Elizabeth. I think Alison is going to give the context of the section 1, and then I will, introduction to it, and I'll go through the section. Is that right, Alison? Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. So let me just explain briefly the context from which I come at the subject. So I teach international relations, and when I kind of fell into teaching civic engagement, I was not one of the converted. I was not one of the choir. I am one of the converted to doing it. It surrounds teaching students about their global local connections, and it involves a local model UN that I run for high schoolers, and I can talk about that in the Q&A if anybody wants to talk about it. But this is the perspective that I come at it from. So while other people come at it from teaching more domestic or national politics, I came at the subject from teaching about global politics, but also, again, connecting it to service learning activity here. But I really, once I got into it and I started working with this wonderful team of people, learned so much more about the value of civic engagement education, and also learned how much we're failing as a whole in civic engagement education at our colleges and universities. So it's gotten, of course, the challenges have gotten greater. Today, we face challenges and anti-democracy threats within and external to established and establishing democracies. As Elizabeth mentioned, there are lots of different threats. There's internal division, there's persistent racism and discrimination, there's the rise of populism, there are changes in our economic systems, big changes that are causing a lot of social and economic disruptions. There's climate change causing more disruptions, power changes in the international system, increased violent conflict in the post-Cold War era, and of course, as if that wasn't all enough, we now have COVID. These situations form the context of our students' education, their growth, and their development. This context is one of increased uncertainty, increased incivility and division, and increased acceptance of violence as a means to settle differences. Although frustration and discontent in our communities is not new, the prevalence of discontent and the questioning of the value of democratic institutions and processes at all levels of our governments and society, that is new. And it is new in these other contexts that I mentioned for both the world and for our students. Most alarming amidst all of this is we're seeing a consistent decline in youth participation and youth satisfaction with democracy. FOA et al. Have found in a global survey that amongst 18 to 34-year-olds, dissatisfaction with democracy has shown the steepest increase, more than double the previous generation at that same age. And this rise in dissatisfaction with democracy correlates to a decline in civic engagement education for exactly this age group. In these contexts, we argue in this book that we have a duty as educators to help our students learn to address threats to democracy, not just by researching and writing about these threats, which is important, but also by teaching them to confront the social, economic, and political sources of these threats, and to learn to work together peacefully despite differing viewpoints to maintain and improve our democratic systems. Now, we seek to achieve this goal in this book through the following ways. One, by teaching them knowledge about democratic processes and institutions, the issues that arise in our communities, and how to discern credible sources of information. Second, by providing them with opportunities to build and practice the skills necessary to navigate and lead in a democratic context, including how to peacefully and respectfully navigate political differences. Next, by teaching them about and fostering the values of democracy and lifelong participation. And finally, in the book, we look at how we can offer students opportunities to experience participation and leadership to build that vital sense of efficacy that their voices and their actions matter. We need to provide these civic engagement education options for all students in all disciplines, at all types of educational institutions, and in all countries. As we pursue other educational goals, we need to include civic engagement education as a foundation of all of their education, so that we're fostering what Danielle Allen has termed participatory readiness. This means that we need to build our democracies with geographically, professionally, and politically diverse people who hold a wide variety of viewpoints and experiences, and who are educated in how government works, how problems can be peacefully confronted, and how we can work together to find mutually beneficial solutions. If we do not do these things, we will forfeit all that we have fought to protect and build in too many wars in the last century. As Dewey and Booton have reminded us, these democratic citizens, those who fight for democracy, they're not just born. You don't just suddenly, you're born in the United States or the UK or some other democratic country, so boom, you're a democratic citizen. That's not quite how it works. Instead, we have to continually renew and build participation, leadership, and support for democracy. We also can't just teach it once and be done. Like, oh, well, you got that one class in high school or secondary ed or whatever it was, and okay, you're done. No, just like math skills, just like vocabulary skills and reading, we must regularly build and add to a ladder of learning for democracy throughout a student's education. In the post-Cold War context and an increasingly globalized higher education situation, civic engagement education is vital to thwarting authoritarian challenges to democracy at home and abroad, and the loss of people's rights. And continued research and idea exchanges on best practices in civic engagement education, such as in this book, with our colleagues across the world, is crucial to answering these threats. This book hopes to bring together educators throughout the world in a community of civic engagement education practice that is accessible to all and brings the benefits of civic engagement education to youth around the world, so that every child has their own arsenal of democracy in their knowledge, their skills, their values, and their sense of efficacy. Further, as access to higher education expands to more people, educators and administrators face a wider range of students' knowledge and skills when they enter college. We need to provide welcoming communities which support all manners of diversity, but we must also address what Elizabeth Beaumont has termed the democratic achievement gap. This book explores where we might confront that gap before students reach college, in addition to in college, such as in the training of teachers, in vocational education, and in K-12 education. In the first section of the book, which Alistair is about to review, our contributors address the challenge of teaching civic engagement in less liberal contexts, and the challenge of creating and offering civic engagement education which promotes political participation as more than just a hobbyist activity. Again, as higher education itself is globalizing, this book we feel is an important step in bringing us together to build this community of practice in how we might share best practices, how we might create connections, and how we might learn to advance our common goals. Thank you. Alistair, you're up.
Yeah, I'm up. I'm getting my slides up. There we go. I'm just going to talk through in terms of the role of how we're going to go through the rest of tonight. We're going to sort of review the different sections. So I think this first section, as Alison has mentioned, really provides an important context, and particularly the first chapter, you know, that heading there by Candice Archbalds and our colleagues about stop training global political hobbyists. It kind of speaks to many of the challenges that we probably find in universities in relation to some of the activities that we do. My own university has probably, you know, got many experiences of that, and we may have involved, you know, in terms of training activities, and others have as well. But what is the implications of those activities in terms of providing students with these sort of experiences, and how are they situated? And what those authors really, you know, get to the core of is particularly the sort of the situatedness of the experience, and actually trying to reflect on the significance of it, and also the implications. And they take a particular approach. They take a feminist approach in doing that, but also are trying to sort of see the work that students do from a particular angle, and that angle is really from an activist approach. And it's about trying to ensure that, you know, students just don't pitch up and think this is a fuzzy, nice experience, and then, you know, put it on their CV and then go off to work for, you know, a merchant bank, or, you know, an accountancy firm, or a global telecommunications firm, but actually sort of think about the implications and the considerations of it, and actually how's that gone about. So they contend that, you know, traditional political engagement pedagogy is to be supplemented with approaches that are grounded in transnational feminist activism, to define that here as a grassroots movement, but also as an academic perspective. And that kind of, you know, is important, because it's important, I suppose, for me, you know, many of us here today are probably, you know, from privileged contexts of our own universities, and often we sort of face, you know, town and gown sort of considerations of our local environment. But the book also, in that kind of global context, that goes into chapter 2, brings into bear sort of you know, experiences maybe from less privileged contexts, and this, you know, very timely in the context of COP26 taking place, you know, my native Scotland recently, about the UN SDGs. And in that chapter, you know, what they're really, you know, highlighting is both the benefits, but also the perils of some of you can see of these activities, the dependency relationships that are important. You know, how come you know, some universities are very much dependent on particular support, funding, initiatives to get things going, but also the implications of that in terms of making an impact in their local context. But that you know, and drawing that out, highlighting clearly some of the tensions that are involved there in terms of sort of, you know, you can imagine promoting sustainable development, but within a developing country. And that kind of tension or context is also then explored in our next chapter by Tai Sun, one of the editors, when he kind of, you know, brings to the fore that issue, how do you highlight or engage civic engagement education in countries and provide that experiences where they're from an authoritarian context. Now, in other chapters of the book, we might explore that in a bit more detail, but in this chapter, it brings that to the fore, the implications of that, and also how you work with states, and they highlight, the nature of the reach of the Communist Party into the implications for themselves when they were setting up their activities in the United States out of the university project, but also having to sort of work with them and also trying to bring changes. So it highlights to some extent the dualistic nature of these activities that is very much a diplomacy angle, going back to Alison's sort of background, but also just in many ways the bargaining that has to sometimes take place. And then we've another chapter that's sort of exploring that a bit further about with liberal contexts, and that is really again another highlighting chapter about the context here of work that's taking place in Singapore, a very developed country, city-state on the one hand, but also a country that has a different kind of political sphere, and also in the context since the chapter has been written, one where the sort of the arrangements of this particular university where the colleague is from is also has changed. So it's highlighting, I suppose, the legal restrictions that take place and the way in which norms foster particular arrangements. And then finally, from the UK colleague John Craig highlights the way in which civic education and also the UK sector has expanded. And it's interesting, I think, in that when we reflect in the UK, both debates about are there too many universities, not enough universities, what is the nature of a university, but also in many ways the way in which these things have been largely a responsive mode rather than a proactive mode in terms of how universities have chased particular goals or metrics, rather than necessarily thinking about what were their civic roots and ethos as they might have been established over a century ago. So that then takes us on to section 2, which Elizabeth is going to talk about in more detail.
Okay, thank you, Alistair. Yes, as Alistair mentioned, with our colleague Thais Sun from Christopher Newport University, I co-edited section 2, which is entitled Civic Engagement Pedagogy Across the Globe. And this section in many ways, builds upon the work of the previous 2 books. Certainly one important message we're trying to get across with all of these texts is that in many ways, the campus is a microcosm of democracy. You're learning the skills, the knowledge, the attitudes of democratic citizenship, and that can take place throughout the campus, in residence life, in extracurricular activities, but certainly without a doubt, the classroom is critically important. And it is really a microcosm of democracy, an opportunity to teach the many facets of citizenship. And similar to the other 2 books also, we're trying to offer educators models, examples, templates of how they might weave civic engagement instruction into their coursework. Most importantly, no matter what their background, no matter what the discipline or subfield. So for example, in the first book, offering models for scholars in IR, comparative politics, public policy, a range of subfields. Similarly, in teaching civic engagement across the disciplines, we were trying to demonstrate that teaching civic engagement can be done not only in political science classrooms, but in civil engineering, in the arts, in education. And the same for this text, can be done across the globe in a variety of democratic contexts, with the emphasis on the fact it can be done without sacrificing core curricular content. Doesn't mean throwing away your syllabus that you've been using for the last 10 years or so. Hopefully we're updating our syllabus. But just to give you a sense of the sort of chapters that are in this text, as you see them all listed here, I'll briefly just touch on them. The first one, chapter 6, is a really interesting chapter and begins with just how students conceive of civic engagement. As Alison referenced earlier, we're hoping with our civic engagement education, we're always building upon scaffolding instruction. So this one, we're really looking at how do students just conceptualize the notion of civic engagement. And this is an interesting exercise. It's an exercise in which students are asked to use freehand drawing to draw how they visualize civic engagement, how they visualize democratic civic engagement. And interestingly done in two contexts, in Ireland, but also in Egypt. So first of all, it offers students an entry point if they're having difficulty articulating how they view civic engagement, their thoughts about democracy. It's an entry point that may be different, especially for students who may find it difficult to articulate their views on civic engagement. And then it certainly is interesting and noteworthy to be doing it in the two contexts, two very different democratic contexts of Ireland and Egypt. And so it offers not only an interesting and effective pedagogical approach, but it offers that first opportunity for students to explore how do we think about democratic citizenship? What does it mean to be a democratic citizen? We build upon that chapter with the chapter from New Zealand by Beausoleil and Timperley, in which they look at a course that they offer to upper level students for teaching civic engagement. And it's unique in its approach in that it places civic agency, cultivating students' civic agency as the prime learning objective. Rather than just looking at maybe institutional mechanisms of formal politics. They really center it around teaching civic agency by allowing students to explore topics that are of critical interest to their students, and I would say probably to a lot of our students. In particular, they really explored climate change and racism. But again, focusing on civic agency as an entry point for students to consider civic engagement. They offer not only an exploration of their course, model syllabi, but certainly students' reflections in a series of journals to the course content. Then we move on to St. Petersburg State University, Professor Dmitry Lanko. This chapter is interesting for many reasons. Not only he's a political scientist, but this is an international relations course. So again, building on this notion that it can be, teaching civic engagement can take place in a variety of subfields. And then certainly being situated in St. Petersburg State University and in a context that, an interesting context, more of authoritarian context, to be teaching democracy. And what he's doing is looking at a simulation of foreign policy and looking to, he does a simulation of a think tank and one-on-one negotiations, but again, the use of a simulation to teach democratic concepts in a context that is not terribly democratic. So again, an opportunity to apply these models to a variety of settings. And then we move on to the Burton chapter, Gerardo Burton, who is a scholar, also is situated at Freedom House. And he's looking at collaborations. I think it's an interesting chapter on how universities can collaborate with outside agencies to teach democratic citizenship, not only to their own students, but to students in that environment. He's looking at partnerships with the United Nations, specifically the United Nations Development Program that partnered with universities in Belize and Guatemala to offer workshops that were led by students of the universities at Belize and Guatemala to young emerging leaders in these locations, students in their late teens, early 20s, teaching what he refers to, or a model referred to as the social audit approach, social audit workshops that teach participation, that teach advocacy, and that encourage young adults to go to set expectations of their government based on public integrity, accountability. So a model of not only partnerships between outside agencies and universities, but certainly an example of how young adults in colleges can reach out and work with young adults in their communities. And then finally, we take that one step further with a chapter from Greece, Students Teaching Democracy to Other Students, the Effects on Political Engagement, in which we have, again, college students who are creating workshops on democratic citizenship, offering it not only to their peers at the university, but to young adults in the city of Greece, or in the city where the university is based. And again, building on this scholarship that's been done here in the United States on the effects of peer-to-peer mobilization, peer-to-peer education, and find positive results on young adults' political knowledge, their sense of efficacy, their skills, when young adults are reaching out to other young adults. So another model that I think has been honed in the United States, but then applied in a different context and just enlarging our pedagogical toolbox. And on that, I'll stop and I'll hand off, I think, to my colleague, Elizabeth Benyon, who will talk about section 3.
Thank you. Section 3 provides diverse examples of interdisciplinary institutional programs that strengthen civic engagement inside and outside of the classroom. 2 chapters provide models of civic engagement that seek to engage all students on campus. Suzanne Todd and William Muck of North Central College in Naperville, Illinois, and Abraham Goldberg, Dina Pastor, and Kara Ongwaley from James Madison University in Harrisburg, Virginia, offer a comparative look at how 2 institutions, a small private liberal arts college in a major metropolitan area and a large comprehensive university in a rural area, embed civic engagement for all students through curricular and co-curricular programs. One institution has integrated civic engagement into general education, while the other, James Madison University, has developed campus-wide year-round voter education and engagement initiatives. In the US context, the authors argue for a sense of urgency in preparing students to participate in a healthy, functional, and inclusive society due to concerns about threats to democracy, democratic institutions, and also widespread economic inequality in the United States. Catherine Shea Sanger from NUS College in Singapore and Wei Lit Yu from Hong Kong Baptist University offer a model of civic engagement in the less liberal political context of Singapore. Civic engagement is threaded throughout a common curriculum with opportunities for civic learning both inside and outside of the classroom. Students confirm that the institutional culture, common curriculum, active approaches to learning, and the residential nature of their globally diverse campus contribute to their preparation for civic and political engagement, despite the numerous barriers they encounter to engagement for both domestic and international students, sometimes including outright bans on certain kinds of political activities, including, of course, protests, which shifts much of the political activity to the campus itself. Mark Charlton and Alistair Blair, who you all know, of De Montfort University in the UK, explore volunteering as a way to build social capital and create civic engagement opportunities for students of all majors. While previous studies find a link between volunteering and civic engagement broadly defined, the literature provides little evidence that volunteering leads to enhanced political knowledge or engagement. Here, the authors find that focused volunteering for university students can better enhance participants' political awareness by exposing them to people directly affected by specific political decisions and public policies, including refugees and migrant communities. Collectively, the authors featured in this section of the book make it clear that innovative and diverse pedagogies should be employed to foster active citizenship that has a positive impact for students and for community partners. Zaman Koray Manilo and Mariana Baccarini, both of the Federal University of Paraíba, Brazil, offer insights into the power of political theater as a pedagogical approach for a community outreach project in Brazil, where state leadership challenges democratic institutions. Students are empowered to practice education as emancipation, a framework inspired by Paula Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. They are actively engaged with the community through conversation circles and lectures presented by community members. Students also participate in the theater of the oppressed, identifying topics democratically through communal conversations and suggestions. In the South African context, Lauren Piper, Sandra Bailey, and Robin Pisensi, all of the University of Western Cape, explore the connections between work-integrated learning and the promotion of active citizenship. This pedagogy is most often framed as the integration of theoretical classroom knowledge and practical workplace knowledge. And work-integrated learning clearly is the type of learning supported by the state rather than what we might think of as civic engagement education. However, the authors of the chapter explain how programs can reimagine and redesign work-integrated learning as a form of community-based learning that promotes civic skills and democratic engagement, including by placing students with NGOs and nonprofit organizations that share this civic engagement goal. Study abroad programs are another space where institutional programs strengthen civic engagement both inside and outside of the classroom. 2 chapters in Section 3 examined programs with US-based students studying abroad in West Africa. Each offers a useful model and perspective on civic engagement. Nicole Webster of Pennsylvania State University approaches global civic engagement with a critical lens. Her institution's commitment to strategic partnerships facilitated the development of a center with connections to existing partners in Burkina Faso and an emphasis on global challenges. Her work seeks transformation for students and for communities. There's a clear emphasis in this work on the community's perspectives, histories, and narratives as students seek to learn and engage in their host country. Webster's argument that civic engagement is an ideal pedagogy to develop informed citizenry comes with a rather large caveat, that civic engagement must be inclusive with equitable engagement of the community, guided by a vision of global citizenship that centers on social justice and equity. This approach to global civic engagement also requires a decentering of US and European viewpoints. Amina Sila and Don Wergs, both professors at Towson University, where Allison Rios McCartney teaches, again in Baltimore, Maryland, they also tackle the concept of global citizenship as they lead an experiential learning program for US-based students in the Gambia and Senegal. The program facilitates cross-national interactions between the global North and global South in the context of a global citizenship where inequities and issues of justice persist. This chapter offers a model for course design rooted in theories of community development that students test and refine in theories of community through really discussions with the community and critical reflection. The authors examine students' enhanced understanding of global citizenship in light of participation in the program, which includes empathy with community residents, challenges to globalization, and a recognition of the effects of gender and religion in shaping individual and community opportunities and outcomes. In sum, the chapters in Section 3 of the book offer diverse approaches to institutional civic engagement programs. By offering examples from a variety of countries, disciplines, and institutional types, we seek to spark a conversation about institutional approaches to civic engagement worldwide, approaches that prepare students for diverse and meaningful engagement in their own communities for many years to come.
Okay, and then thanks, Elizabeth. It's over to Dick, who's going to be introducing Section 4. That's and sort of presenting the broader context of the finale of the book.
So I suspect you're a little bit overwhelmed by now. 400 pages of information on global civic engagement, not to mention the other 2 books, which are equally long. I want to break it down back just to the simple concepts and then to propose a new era of civic engagement that requires an agenda for change and a work by all of us. So first of all, the context is in part, democracy had a huge upswing in the 1990s. And we were so excited that democracy was becoming the standard in the world, and many nations were moving into new democracies. But in the 21st century, we've had a retreat. For the last 15 years, we've had a decline of democracy and an increase in populism in various forms, or autocracy, which is a term I prefer. And we've been losing ground, to put it simply. And at the same time, we've seen the dissatisfaction of youth and the decline in participation. Although, for instance, in the last election in 2020, we just got the figures from the United States, and we had a huge uptick in student participation and youth participation in the 2020 election, which was so crucial to the question of whether America would become or remain a democracy. So civic engagement, in short, is more important than it's ever been. But civic engagement takes a different form also than it's been in the past. We have civic engagement in individual courses, and in this book and in the previous ones, we provide a lot of examples of how a course can be made effective and have an impact on a student and their life. We then think about civic engagement across the disciplines, that this is not a task just for political science, but for all disciplines. And with this book and with the conversation today, we're talking about civic engagement, not only across the entire university, but across the globe. And we found that we can learn from each other no matter what our country, that there are methods and tools and ideas and concepts and contestation, and arguments about what we should be doing that stem from every part of the world today. But we need also a common agenda and a common plan of action. We need better cooperation between us and our organizations, and this has to be an international cooperation. In general, across countries, we need more resources, but we also need more knowledge and we need more recognition. So in a simple part, the chapter on the new agenda or what needs to be done has more suggestions, but I want to just highlight a few. First of all, we need better recognition and greater funding at both the national level, but in most of our universities. Our universities sometimes say they're dedicated towards democracy or civic engagement, but often they don't provide the training and don't provide the emphasis and don't provide the sense of urgency that's necessary. At the national levels, across most of our countries, we need to pass new laws requiring civic engagement education, not only at the universities, but at the elementary and high school level. In the United States, as we sit here today, we have a proposal in Congress called Civic Secures Democracy Act. And what that would do in the United States is it would put civic engagement on the same level as STEM education. And it would allocate billions of dollars to ensure that civic engagement was improved at every level, particularly the K through 12, the elementary, the middle school, and the high school levels. As we stress in the book, and in several of my co-editors and authors have said, we also need to understand that we need model civic learning programs, including in less liberal countries. Just because there's a place like Singapore or China or Russia doesn't mean that no civic learning is needed in those societies. And it is possible to get civic learning even under the restrictions of communism or authoritarianism. In terms of the recognition, one of the things we can jointly do, and you can be of huge help in this, is we need to promote the publication of research on the scholarship of teaching civic engagement. That is, we need new books like the one we're discussing now. We need new journal articles. We need newsletters. We need blogs. This is essentially, even though it goes back 100 years or more in both UK and the United States, this is a new field of study. This is a new area. And we need our national organizations and our disciplinary organizations and our international organizations in academia to promote this study and to reward it. So we need support from national and international education associations. We need the conferences to highlight it. We need publications, we need awards, we need special sections in our disciplinary organizations that would promote the idea of civic engagement education. And we need to make teaching civic engagement a meaningful component of merit and promotion decisions in our universities. Yes, some of us will do civic engagement education anyway because we believe in it. But it would be easier if we were rewarded for doing it. As you see from the articles that are in this last section, one of the things we need to do is to expand civic engagement education to training schools, sometimes called vocational schools, and to community colleges. And then at the international level, we need to adopt either a new UN declaration in favor of civic engagement, or we need to amend the 2018 UN Youth Declaration on Youth World Citizenship that I've yet to meet anybody who had actually known about it before I told them about it. There is a UN declaration and it does vaguely support civic engagement, but we need to do more. We need to be unified and we need to cooperate, and we need to think of this as a political agenda in the sense that we want to get new policies. We want to get new policies in our university. We want to get new policies in our disciplines, and we want to get new policies in the world because democracy is literally at stake.